Welcome to episode 95 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who lived in the age of Julius Caesar and who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. At this point in our podcast, we've completed our first line-by-line review of the poem, and we've temporarily turned our attention to the presentation of Epicurean ethics found in Cicero's own Ends. But before we start with today's episode, let me remind you of our 3 ground rules. First, our aim is to bring you an accurate presentation of classical Epicurean philosophy as the ancient Epicureans understood it, which is not the same as presented by many modern commentators. We hope that our fresh perspective will encourage you to rethink the meaning of Epicurean philosophy for yourself. Second, we won't be talking about contemporary philosophical or political issues in this podcast, and in fact we'll stay as far away from them as possible. We want everyone to understand that Epicurus had a unique philosophy of his own. Epicurus was not a Stoic, a humanist, a Buddhist, a Taoist, an atheist, a Marxist, or a modern politician of the left or right. And it is very unfair to Epicurus and to ourselves to try to force Epicurean philosophy into one of those modern boxes. Third, Lucretius's poem is mainly concerned with the many details of Epicurean physics, but we'll always try to learn from those details what they mean for the best way to live our own lives. Lucretius will show that Epicurus was not obsessed with luxury, but neither did he teach minimalism or asceticism, as you will often find written on the internet today. Epicurus taught that pleasure is the ultimate guide of life, not supernatural gods, not the abstractions of idealism, and not absolute notions of virtue. Epicurus taught that there are no supernatural beings, no fate, and no life after death. That means that any happiness we'll ever have must come in this life, which is why it is so important not to waste time in confusion. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive to you, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you will find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Now let's join our panel for today's discussion with Martin reading today's text.
But let what has been said on this occasion suffice concerning the brilliant and famous actions of illustrious men. We shall indeed find a fitting opportunity by and by for discoursing about the tendency of all the virtues towards pleasure. At present, however, I shall shew what is the essence and what are the characteristics of pleasure, so as to remove all confusion caused by ignorant people, and to make it clear how serious, how sober, how austere is that school, which is esteemed to be pleasure-seeking, luxurious, and effeminate. For the pleasure which we pursue is not that alone which excites the natural constitution itself by a kind of sweetness, and of which the sensual enjoyment is attended by a kind of agreeableness, but we look upon the greatest pleasure as that which is enjoyed when all pain is removed. Now, inasmuch as whenever we are released from pain, we rejoice in the mere emancipation and freedom from all annoyance, and everything whereat we rejoice is equivalent to pleasure, just as everything whereat we are troubled is equivalent to pain. Therefore, the complete release from pain is rightly termed pleasure. For just as the mere removal of annoyance brings with it the realization of pleasure, whenever hunger and thirst have been banished by food and drink, so pain is removed. For just as the mere removal of annoyance brings with it the realization of pleasure, whenever hunger and thirst have been banished by food and drink, so in every case the banishment of pain ensures its replacement by pleasure. Therefore Epicurus refused to allow that there is any middle term between pain and pleasure. What was thought by some to be a middle term, the absence of all pain, was not only itself pleasure, but the highest pleasure possible. Surely anyone who is conscious of his own condition must needs be either in a state of pleasure or in a state of pain. Epicurus thinks that the highest degree of pleasure is defined by the removal of all pain, so that pleasure may afterwards exhibit diversities and differences, but is incapable of increase or extension. But actually at essence, as my father used to tell me, when he wittily and humorously ridiculed the Stoics, there is in the Ceramicus a statue of Chrysippus sitting with his hand extended, which hand indicates that he was fond of the following little argument. Does your hand, being in its present condition, feel the lack of anything at all? Certainly of nothing. But if pleasure were the supreme good, it would feel a lack. I agree. Pleasure then is not the supreme good. My father used to say that even a statue would not talk in that way if it had power of speech. The inference is shrewd enough as against the Cyrenaics, but does not touch Epicurus. For if the only pleasure were that which, as it were, tickles the senses, if I may say so, and attended by sweetness, overflows them and insinuates itself into them, neither the hand nor any other member would be able to rest satisfied with the absence of pain apart from a joyous activity of pleasure. But if it is the highest pleasure, as Epicurus believes, to be in no pain, then the first admission that the hand in its then existing condition felt no lack was properly made to you, Chrysippus, but the second improperly. I mean that it would have felt a lack had pleasure been the supreme good. It would certainly feel no lack, and on this ground, that anything which is cut off from the state of pain is in the state of pleasure.
Martin, thank you for reading that for us this morning. We did not read as much text today as we have in the past because this material, these 3 paragraphs, are so packed with information and important material that we really need to go through them very, very closely. They're not only packed, but they're very complicated and they're very controversial in what they mean. But our panel is going to explain them all with absolute clarity to everyone today. Right, Don?
Sure. Let's go for it.
All joking aside, this is incredibly important material, and we're going to do the best we can to try to at least introduce the issues that surround it. Whole books have been written trying to explain the issues that are discussed in these passages, and we're not going to be able to cover all those details today. But it is our purpose to try to bring to everyone a common sense and practical understanding of how to apply Epicurean philosophy. And we're going to hopefully at least bring the beginning of clarity to some of this material and help people understand whether Epicurean philosophy is worth pursuing in their own lives or not. So let's begin line by line. The very first line, but let what has been said on this occasion suffice concerning the brilliant and famous actions of illustrious men. We shall indeed find a fitting opportunity by and by for discoursing about the tendency of all the virtues towards pleasure. So right there, Torquatus is making the point that for the time being, we're not going to talk today about how virtue does lead towards pleasure in actual life. He's going to put that aside and start with something else, which he describes as, at present, however, I shall show what is the essence and what are the characteristics of pleasure, so as to remove all confusion caused by ignorant people.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting. I actually looked up. I was curious what the original Latin was for the ignorant people, and because I think ignorant has a lot of semantic baggage with it. So the actual Latin term that he uses there is imperitus, which is defined, at least in the dictionary, by a number of ways. It says inexperienced in anything, not knowing, unacquainted with, unskilled, without experience. So these people don't really have even experience with what is actually in Epicurean philosophy. They just have sort of a stereotypical view of it. It's the way I'm interpreting that, ignorant people.
It's interesting to me to think about whether Cicero, in reading this, was considering himself to be among the people who were being classified as ignorant here, because that gets back to what we discussed last week a little bit.
I think Cicero thinks that he knows all and sees all and is
right.
You know.
So Torquatus is talking as if the main problem is that there's confusion by people who don't understand the philosophy.
Right.
But he's talking to Cicero, who really knows it very well.
At least according to Cicero.
At least according to Cicero. Yes, indeed. Maybe I should finish that first sentence there. And to make it clear how serious, how sober, how austere is that school which is esteemed to be pleasure-seeking, luxurious, and effeminate. Let me comment on effeminate for just a second. It's not a good word to be using, I don't think, in this context. I think that the proper meaning of it here would not be a reference to sex or anything like that, but what's the cowardice?
Yeah, I had the same feeling with that particular word, too, in the translation. The Latin term is mollis, and it basically means to make soft or to become unmanly, in the stereotypical way, that sort of thing. So that's the connotation of that term, mollis.
Right. The word has such bad connotations today to even discuss it in that context. But I do think it has a very important meaning for us to be considering here, because that's the whole attack that Cicero and the Stoics and so forth have on Epicurean philosophy, is that you're so much of a coward that you're not willing to do what's necessary to really achieve the best life you could possibly achieve. You're just looking for softness, luxury, rest, and relaxation, and you're just not up to the challenge of the best life that you should be up to.
Exactly. And it goes back to the whole metaphor that they used about the eunuchs and calling the Epicureans eunuchs. You can make a eunuch out of a man, but not a man out of a eunuch sort of thing.
Yeah, with the background being that the issue that you want to use your life the best way you possibly can. It's not a matter of glory, but you want to use your life the best way you can. You don't want to waste your time. You want to get what there is to get out of life and not be misled, not be distracted, not just procrastinate, which is one of my big sins. You've got to just really seize the day, as what was that Horace would say. So I think that's the point.
And I find it interesting that he describes the Epicurean school as serious and sober and austere. I mean, that he's saying, we're serious about this. We're obvious conintens and severa. That's the three Latin words that he uses right there. Serious, and they're moderate, they're continens, and they're sober. They're looking at life, in a very serious, sober way to get the best out of it.
Okay, the next sentence is going to take us into the heart of the controversy, and we haven't heard enough from Martin and Joshua yet before we get into the controversy. Do you guys have anything to say about those first couple of sentences before we get into the type of pleasure we pursue?
I have nothing to add.
Joshua?
Well, I am curious about this line that you're trying to draw here. I don't know really how to articulate it, but particularly as it surrounds that word effeminate, it seems like you're making this something more to do about duty, like duty or virtue. Is that?
Well, I'm just saying that I think that the heart of what he's describing when he uses the word effeminate is he's using it, I think, as a synonym more for cowardice or softness. And I don't think that's an inherent aspect of feminine nature or women or anybody else. I think it's much better to focus on the real character attribute that's being discussed is the line I'm trying to draw. Now, I don't know if that helps or not. Don, have I dug myself into a hole with that distinction, or would you say it differently?
No. I think you're right. I mean, the whole idea of that word, from what I can see in the standard dictionaries and stuff, is that they're characterizing the Epicureans as, soft and, unmanly and, tamed and, this kind of thing. And the actual definition here is in a bad sense, soft, effeminate, unmanly, weak. And so that's how the ignorant people are characterizing the Epicureans.
Or the Stoics, who also characterize the Epicureans, whether they're ignorant about Epicurean philosophy or not.
Exactly.
Okay, we'll plow forward then into this next sentence, which is going to be very important to unwind. For the pleasure which we pursue is not that alone which excites the natural constitution itself by a kind of sweetness, and of which the sensual enjoyment is attended by a kind of agreeableness. Let me stop right there and let's discuss what he's saying right there. What is he saying in this first clause when he says it's not that alone?
He seems to be saying that while those things are pleasure and therefore good, that's not the whole of what we mean by the word pleasure. It's not merely eat, drink, and be happy, for tomorrow you will die. Yeah, and he does get close to something like a definition of the word pleasure, which we were talking about a couple of weeks ago. We couldn't really get a handle on what we meant, but he's got it written down, because we would say, just look to what the infant reaches for. Even the infant knows to reach for pleasure. But here he says that at least part of what pleasure means is that which excites the natural constitution by a kind of sweetness, and of which the sensual enjoyment is attended by a kind of agreeableness. So we've got two criteria of what this physical pleasure seems to be. So I'll be interested to go forward to see how we describe the rest of the picture of what pleasure is meant to be.
I think that's a great point. Don or Martin, do you have any elaboration on that?
I would agree with that. It strikes me that this is what, if you ask somebody to describe pleasure, this is the definition they're going to give. And I think what the character of Torquatus is saying is, that's part of it, but we're going to go on and talk about the all-encompassing idea of pleasure.
And we don't have to read too many words to get the rest of the sentence. But we look upon the greatest pleasure as that which is enjoyed when all pain is removed. Period. Don.
Cassius.
If he had said, but we look upon also as pleasure that which is enjoyed when all pain is removed, that would itself be a very interesting topic to discuss. But he doesn't say also. He says we look upon the greatest pleasure as that which is enjoyed when all pain is removed. So the topic we need to discuss is how is that which is enjoyed when all pain is removed pleasure? And how is it, quote, the greatest pleasure, unquote? There's two things there going on. Don't everyone speak at once.
Okay, I think we need to start tying in some principal doctrines here, maybe, which I don't have to hand. But it's curious to me. The greatest pleasure is the removal of all pain. But isn't there that principal doctrine where he says the limit of pleasure is reached with the removal of all pain?
That's number three. The limit of quantity, in some translations, it's very specific that it's a quantity. The limit of quantity of pleasure is reached when all pain is removed.
I think I'm pretty sure he means this, even though he doesn't say it exactly the same way. What he means is exactly that.
How so, Martin? Keep going.
If you read the next sentences, it gives the details on this one. So that means if once we feel no more hungry after eating, then this is called just in itself pleasure.
And I think we have to address the idea that, I mean, it says, at least in the translation, the greatest pleasure is that which was enjoyed when all pain is removed. It's not the removal of the pain that is pleasure. It's the fact, at least, are we saying that pleasure takes the place of pain? And so that whenever you are filled with pleasure, by definition, all pain has been removed.
Yes.
That's an interesting way to put it, Don, because there's two different ways you could take that, right? You could say that the act of relieving pain is in itself pleasurable, or you could say that there's this, it's a binary state where either one of them is on or the other one is on. Pleasure.
Exactly.
I mean, it can be both. When we feel the pain goes away, we can feel this as pleasure. So it's somewhere in there. So that, for example, after I hurt myself and the pain is still there but going down, then the hope is there it will soon disappear quickly. So and that in itself is pleasurable, but that's only a sensual pleasure of the moment. And then when that pain is completely gone, then it is this maximized, this contribution to maximize pleasure.
Let me try to frame a couple of things that we're going to be discussing maybe for the rest of the episode here today. But as I look at these passages, which are denominated as 37 and 38 in lines, the rest of passage 37 appears to me to be largely the point that Martin was making a moment ago. It's just an example after example about how removal of a pain results in pleasure. And then in 38, he turns to the point that I think Don was making, that there's no middle ground between pain and pleasure. And so you've got a sort of a definitional, if you only have two of something, and you don't have the one, then you have the other. You have sort of an equivalence of quantity measurement going on that he's discussing in 38 there. So maybe one way of looking at all this is that there's a lot of underlying presumptions that are going on here that have to be thought about when you take this, what would appear to be on its face to be a very simple statement when it says the greatest pleasure is that which is enjoyed when all pain is removed. That seems to be simple, but the Epicurean foundation and the principal doctrines, and possibly even going back into the fundamentals of nature about the way the universe is, Epicurean philosophy is built as a structure on top of those, and you can't forget what was already established when we studied nature in the first place, including principal doctrine number 2 about how all good and evil comes to us through sensation. And maybe this is the ultimate point that I want to make early and often, that, okay, does this statement mean when it says that the greatest pleasure is that which is enjoyed when all pain is removed, does that mean that our goal in life is to achieve numbness?
No.
If not, why not?
Because pleasure is an active principle. You feel pleasure. So, I mean, even if it's ataraxia or tranquility or whatever you call it, you feel that as a positive.
Well, now you say that pleasure is an active principle, but I challenge you to go to Wikipedia or any other article on the internet and read about Epicurus and pleasure, and you will be told that the highest pleasure in Epicurean terms is katastematic pleasure, which stands for stable. And it's the opposite of active, because there are two types, everybody says on the internet. There's katastematic and there's kinetic. Kinetic is active. Katastematic is very difficult for them to define, but whatever it is, it's not active, because the active is the kinetic. So what you've just said a moment ago is that pleasure is active. How do you reconcile that, Don?
My interpretation of and I you know what, I don't know whether I've ever heard that word pronounced before.
Let's talk about what's the right pronunciation.
In my head, it's always catastematic, but
catastematic. That sounds good. That's much more eloquent than the way I said it. Catastematic.
But the thing that I'm coming around to with that whole distinction is that catastematic is stable and kinetic is something that changes over time. So the examples that Epicurus gives for the catastematic pleasures are ataraxia and aponia, which are, no pain and tranquility. So those are stable conditions of the body. I'm coming around to the idea too that it sort of coincides with the biological term of homeostasis. Your body's in homeostasis. Everything's working well. Everything's good. It's nice and stable. Whereas if you are, excited or joyous or gleeful, or he uses euphrosyne and chara as examples of kinetic pleasures in the letter to Menoikeus, and those sort of change over time. I mean, you can have higher or lower levels of excitement or glee or joy, that sort of thing. But something like ataraxia or tranquility is a stable state where you're just sort of like, humming along. I always like the metaphor of calm seas whenever it comes to ataraxia. From what I understand, there's an ancient Greek metaphor that has to do with calm seas, that is a metaphor for ataraxia. So it's a stable condition as opposed to something that is up and down or changes.
I thought a minute ago, though, you described pleasure as something that's an active principle. Is that still okay with you or not?
I think active in the sense that it's something that you feel that you have
experience. How about that?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, that you experience. Yeah. And again, that goes back to your point about the whole idea of that we can only experience pleasure when we're alive and sensing things and have sensations. So that's why death is nothing to us.
Martin and Joshua, who would like to tackle this next? Because I really do want to hear from everybody on this particular point. And the question is basically for people who listen to the podcast, who've read so much about Epicurus on the internet, when they read the greatest pleasure is that which is enjoyed when all pain is removed. I think another way of asking the question is describe to those people what we mean when we say that which is enjoyed when all pain is removed.
So, just to comment on that, it doesn't mean numbness. So if in case we are numb, we basically can feel bored, and that is some kind of pain. So we want some pleasure, some more active type of pleasure being added to the thing. Even though if we do not feel physical pain, this boredom is a pain. So, and that means we are not yet at the maximum level of pleasure. That one is meant by this. So when we want also the pain from boredom to be removed.
That's what I like that.
Yeah, that does help, Martin, because obviously numbness does have that connotation of an unpleasant experience when your jaw is numbed when you're in the dentist office. It may not be painful, but you wouldn't characterize that as something that you wish to experience either. But going beyond that, though, once you eliminate numbness as something that you're talking about, well, there's so many questions embroiled here. Back into the issue of whether there is a single best kind of pleasure to experience or not. I don't think we've really even solved that question.
No, and I still go back to that has to do with desires. It's the choice worthiness of particular pleasures at a particular time.
Well, then what are we discussing here when it says the greatest pleasure as that which is enjoyed when all pain is removed? What do those two words, the greatest pleasure, mean?
That means there's no further increase quantitatively there because we're already at the maximum.
What are some examples of the type of pleasure that you think would constitute the greatest pleasure? That's another way of asking the same question. Maybe.
Isn't the only thing that is said to have like complete and total pleasure all the time are the Epicurean gods, or you have the gods are the only ones that experience total and complete pleasure, and then everybody else has pleasure varied over their lifetimes?
See, I think that's a very legitimate question, because I think you're right that only the Epicurean gods could have confidence of being able to sustain their state forever. Because as humans, we cannot have that confidence. We know it's going to come to an end, and yet we reconcile ourselves to it. But even within our human context, there does seem to be something that he refers to as the greatest pleasure, does it not?
We can experience it. So for a while we can be at that, but then of course there will be other things coming in. either then if it's something where we do not really move, but where we sense it in a pleasurable way, eventually somehow boredom will kick in again. And so that means then we may want to do something. If our circulation is at a level where we feel like moving around, then we want to get out of that physical rest and do some activity.
I have another way of asking the same question that I want to ask before I forget it. But you remember we started this passage by Cicero discussing that all philosophers agree that there's something which is your ultimate goal, which everything else is a tool to establish that goal. Are we still talking about that here in this passage? Are we able to identify some specific thing that we ought to always have in front of us as our ultimate goal in life? Is that something that's experienceable even? You see where I'm going?
I don't think he's necessarily talking about that in this particular passage here. I think the character of Torquatus has established that pleasure is the goal, the telos, the highest good, the summum bonum, all that sort of thing. And now he's talking about just pleasure itself as, the maximum pleasure that you can experience. We've established that pleasure is, the highest good. Now we're saying that the maximum amount of pleasure that you can experience is the absence of pain.
All right. We've gone too far without hearing from Joshua.
So I guess I have two concerns here. And one of them relates to something Don said when he brought up the Epicurean conception of the gods. One of my concerns is that we spend a lot of time talking about this, and the question really, as it relates to humans, is purely hypothetical, because we can't reach, really, a state without pain. This is my second concern, and I'm hesitant to say this out loud. Typically, when we get new people that come to the forum, this is one of the questions that they really try to answer for themselves. I'm sure I was the same way. And I don't want to stop, certainly I want people to ask these questions because you're always going to find somebody who wants to talk to you about it. My concern, though, is that in my experience, the more you analyze pleasure, the more it loses its charm. Has anyone else?
That's a good way of saying it.
Yeah.
That's a very good way of saying
it.
Yeah. So I'm trying not to reach for another analogy, but
I think analogy is, you said that last week. I didn't come back at you on that, and I want to come back at you now. I think analogy is exactly the way that Epicurus says that you do explain things. We haven't gotten to the end of this section in Torquatus, but he talks about analogy and comparison as the correct method of thinking. So I don't think you should shy away from using analogies. I think they're the best way. I think Epicurus would say they're the best way of explaining things. So go ahead. I'm sorry for that tangent.
Well, then let me give you an analogy. So there are certain circles in which a particular book is discussed. It's called Getting Things Done. This book is about establishing a system that processes all of the inputs that you have in your life and then turning them more efficiently into outputs so that you have more time to live your life. Does that description make sense? So in other words, you've got an inbox. Everything that you get goes into your inbox. And then you've got this system by which you process it intelligently, efficiently, so that you're constantly caught up, basically, is the idea. The problem with people who are really into this kind of thing is that they spend more time thinking about their system and about efficiency and about getting things done than they spend actually doing the system. Than they spend
getting things done.
Yeah, exactly. And so with pleasure, I think it's the same way. I think if we spend a lot of our time really analyzing pleasure from all these different angles, in a sense, it makes it difficult, or this is the feeling I have, it makes it difficult to just appreciate pleasure in and of itself. But I don't know. What do you think about that?
I want to say you've just stabbed me in the heart because I've just been reading some David Allen Coe this morning on Getting Things Done. And I find that I fall prey exactly to what you're talking about, Joshua, is that you think that there's some system that is going to solve everything for you, and you obsess over the system instead of actually getting anything done. Now, you think it is true that you have to have some kind of a system, and you have to prioritize, and you have to be able to translate your ideas into reality, or else you never get anything done. But if you stay at that level of obsessing over the procedure and what we discussed last week, finality, you have to make a decision and act on it, realizing that you wish you had more information, you wish you could maybe wait longer and gather more help and assistance, and maybe next week the weather will be better and the planets will be aligned in a better better way and you'll be better off by waiting. But you can't do that because of the nature of human life. You have to go ahead and take action. So I struggle with that myself. I think a lot of us probably do struggle exactly with that.
Don't mistake the tools for the goal.
Right. But the tools are useful. It's not that the tools are bad things. You have to have them to some extent, but you have to keep them in priority. Martin, I gather you don't have that problem, so help us with it.
Yeah. So instead of sitting down and spending hours on estimating the coefficients of the matrix I would need if I was to do the hedonic calculus by actual mathematics, I've trained my intuition and I checked back. So if I had a plan to fulfill the desire and did I really get the pleasure I expected, or even a better one or worse? And this will feed back into my intuition. And with intuition, I can make these decisions very fast. So as soon as I know I'm confident, I have enough input, and now is the time, then I go ahead with it. And then I do not need to obsess about the system, because I know I fine-tuned the system based on past experience already. So there is no more need to obsess about it.
I think that's an important point.
Well put, yeah.
Now, this is probably the appropriate point to remind everybody, too, of the quote from Epicurus that's in Plutarch about how the escape from some terrible disaster is the meaning of good for those who can understand the question and don't go walking around uselessly talking about the meaning of good. We can put the site in the episode's show notes, but that's the point he's arguing there as well. So it's possible, and I have this suspicion about a lot of Cicero's arguments here, it's possible that the thread that we're picking up from some recent episodes is that this is an example of going down the rabbit hole, as an analogy, of obsessing over some detail of a word game, which Martin used last week, that catches us in a trap that we never get out of by analyzing this too far.
So, Cassius, that raises an interesting question for us, because we're dealing with people who are just now getting interested in Epicurean philosophy, who want to talk about these questions. And some of us have been dealing with this for, I haven't been dealing with this as long as you have, and you seem to have more patience than I do for analyzing pleasure, I would say. This is my question, how do we sort of stay open to the conversation when we've kind of already settled it for ourselves, even if the way that we settled it doesn't really make all that much sense, or we haven't really thought it through as much as we should?
Yeah, let's talk about that at length, because that's maybe the number one issue confronting all of us in everything that we do here, because the people who want to struggle with this question, it is a rabbit hole. If we stay with this question and never move past it, frankly, I think that's the number one issue that kills Epicurean philosophy in the modern world, that stops people from spending more time with it and understanding it better. That's the first thing they're confronted with on the internet when they read about Epicurus. Epicurus held the greatest pleasure is the absence of pain. He divided pleasure into katastematic and kinetic. Kinetic pleasure is active pleasure, and the only use you have for active pleasure is to get to the state of katastematic pleasure. But katastematic pleasure is not really active, and you don't really feel it. It's just something that's out there that you get when you get rid of pain. Now, isn't that a cute way to describe life, is what these people say? And it makes no sense. It's a turnoff to people who just want to live their lives with some kind of a practical explanation and a practical guide. But I think that's the rabbit hole that is out there. Nobody gets past that. It turns into a word game. It turns into a synonym for Stoicism. And everybody thinks that the Stoics are real cute too, because they have these indifference and these other ideas about how to get past pain. And everybody agrees that happiness is the goal. So why don't we just all get along and forget about all these details of Epicurean philosophy and Stoic philosophy, and just let's be happy and move on. I'm sorry to get wound up on that, but that is from the beginning and probably till the end. But this is the point that you've raised, Joshua. How do we get past it? How do we acknowledge that the issue is there, but not get stuck at that point? Because that's where we frequently get stuck. We got to, like you say, acknowledge to people that the question is a valid and important one. And we have to give them an answer that helps them explain why we're even discussing this. But you've got to move past that if you're going to accomplish anything. I'm sorry. That was too long a rant. Don.
No, just a long enough rant. It's well done. That's like way to encapsulate the problem.
It's my experience that the people who get stuck on that, they just move on. They hear that, they think that it reinforces Stoicism, and they move on down the road with sort of an eclectic collection of aphorisms from different philosophers. And I think there's more to be gained from Epicurean philosophy by staying with it and understanding where he's coming from on all these other issues, rather than just get not traumatized, but anesthetized. It's like a lot of people read into this that being in a state of sort of anesthesia is the goal of life. They find that to be consistent with Stoicism and its indifference to pain and so forth. But I just don't think that's the case.
I find it interesting that you use the term anesthesia there, because the actual Greek word used in Principal Doctrine 2 about the sensation is what we're concerned about. That's the anesthesia is not sensing. It literally means not sensing. And the word that is used in that Principal Doctrine 2 is actually the one that anesthesia is derived from. So the aesthesia part is the actual sensation part. So I find it interesting that you use that word.
I mean, he's basically equating sensation with life, it seems to me, in Principal Doctrine 2. So that pleasure has got to be everything good comes through sensation. And so there's a tight relationship between pleasure and pain and sensation. So therefore, anesthesia, the numbness, the just a state of floating without any stimulation whatsoever, or even any thoughts within your mind, it's got to me, in my mind, the opposite of what Epicurus is suggesting.
And I think it's important too to point out that the whole idea of ataraxia or tranquility, however you want to translate that term, does not equal numbness. I mean, tranquility, if you've experienced, I would say, out on a sunny day, looking up in the sky and close your eyes and feel the heat of the sun on your face and just, let your cares wash away for a few minutes. I mean, that seems to me to be an active feeling of tranquility there.
Yes, that's not anesthesia. You're
exactly.
Not in a coma or anything like that.
Exactly.
Here's something where I would draw an interesting distinction. Sometimes when you come out of the dentist's office and they've numbed, part of your mouth, I never, ever in my life feel better than after I've come out of the dentist's office and I don't have to go back for like 6 months. The numbness in the mouth is actually not a very good feeling.
Right.
But the knowledge that I don't have to go back, for another 6 months, that is a great feeling. So what is the difference because there's nothing particularly pleasurable happening to me. It's just that knowledge that I don't have to go back. This negative stimulus has been removed. But it's different from the actual physical numbness, which I don't enjoy.
I think you set up a really good contrast there between the mental satisfaction or pleasure that you get out of knowing that you don't have to go back and the physical pain of a sort that's still in your physical manifestation of your jaw. Yeah. So there's two different things going on there. And as a human being, last time I checked, Joshua, you were a human being. You get to experience, multiple things at the same time.
Certainly, yes.
Does that make sense?
But not in the same. Then you get the conflict. Right. Question about pain and pleasure can't be in the same place at the same time. I think that's the point. It can't be at the same place at the same time. You can feel your toe in your ear if one of them is stuck with a pin and the other one is somehow being massaged or something. I think you can feel them both at the same time.
This is a hobby horse of mine about the whole idea of multitasking. There is no such thing as multitasking. You attend to one thing and then you attend to another thing, and you can only really attend to one thing at a time. You're not multitasking. You're just doing multiple things in tiny bits at the same, at different times. So, I mean, you're concentrating on one, you're taking pleasure in, to use Joshua's example, taking pleasure in the idea that, oh man, that is done for another 6 months or a year. Thank heavens for that. And then you're like, oh, but my jaw is like, I can't, I'm drooling all over myself. And it's like, this is not a pleasurable experience right here, but man, I don't have to come back, but oh, my jaw.
The point that Joshua raised about the dentist office and leaving it, I think would be important for us to mention that later on, not in the material we covered today, but later on, Torquatus makes the explicit point that pleasures and pains of the mind are frequently much more intense than pleasures and pains of the body are, because the mind knows that the future is out there as well. So I guess what I would hear in Joshua's analogy there is that the mental pleasure of knowing you're not going to be back in the dentist office anytime soon is far and away outweighing any discomfort from the numbness.
And the other side of that, Cassius, is that the anxiety of anticipating your next dental office visit is very often worse than the physical pain you get from actually going to the dentist.
Yep.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yep. And it doesn't necessarily mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't necessarily mean that mental pleasures are, quote unquote, better than physical pleasures. They're just different kinds of ways to experience pleasure.
Well, you're shying away from greater and lesser, or intense or less intense. There's different words that in my mind have to be brought in there. But what I think you're correctly to say that there's no absolute ranking of them out there.
Right. It's value judgments, right? Judgments.
No value judgments. That's where I would use the word better or worse or noble or ignoble or worthy or less worthy, things like that. Those are the criteria that come from Stoicism and would not be appropriate.
That's where we get that, all pleasures are good, but not all pleasures are choice worthy in any particular context. So
Right. Now, there's so much to talk about and so little time. One thing we should try to keep in mind today, let's at least try to cover what the controversies are so that even when we run out of time, we will at least have introduced people to what some of the controversies are. Because when I look at the rest of line 37 here and I see where he's discussing the removal of annoyances, people who get into the study in greater detail are going to want to follow that argument, because in the development of Greek philosophy, there's this, they call this the replenishment theory of pleasure. There's people who try to go down that rabbit hole of categorizing pleasures, who pick up a category and say that, well, one of the most important categories is that you have some pain that needs to be removed, such as hunger that needs to be satisfied by eating. And so they list all these, like hunger, food and thirst and water and all these different things that are need, and they suggest that all pleasure can be viewed as the satisfaction of some kind of need, and they'll take that off in all sorts of directions about how therefore the need is more important, or you don't want to stay on a treadmill, so you really don't want that kind of pleasure in the first place. They take that in all sorts of directions, but even that is not a full description of what pleasure is, because even these Greeks will talk about how when you smell a rose that you didn't expect to, that's a pleasure everybody would acknowledge, but it was not because you lacked smelling the rose that it was a pleasure. It's something that stimulated your senses. So the whole issue of categorizing pleasures into a lot of different types is fraught with danger, I think. But it's out there, and people who wish to read into that, I think one of the best descriptions of it is in Gosling's and Taylor's The Greeks on Pleasure is a book that goes into great detail on that. But you almost have to devote a large part of your life to studying Greek philosophy to trace all the details of their arguments about the nature of pleasure. But those were going on, and those were probably an essential underlying context to this discussion here, because Cicero, Torquatus, the Epicureans, the Stoics, they had these decades and hundreds of years of argument about the nature of pleasure that they were attempting to address. Let's talk about, most of those lines at the end of 37 are devoted to that. Anybody want to talk about the details of removal of pain as pleasure? I mean, maybe that's fairly self-explanatory. Or
here's a question. Can we say, so the phrase that always keeps coming up here is the removal of pain is removed. Can you say, is that the same thing as saying pleasure is added? Because if you have two things and you have more of one and less of another, can you say that whenever there's no more pleasure to be added? I mean, is that the same thing as the maximum pleasure?
I think the answer is yes to that. You come up with all sorts of analogies. One of the ones I think about is the gas tank. When you fill that gas tank, you filled it with gasoline. The air that was in the tank is gone and the tank is full. I think there's many analogies of that kind of quantity measurement that apply.
Because the perspective, or the way it's always stated, and even in, I mean, some of the Epicurean writings is about removal of pain, but it just always strikes me that you're concentrating on what you're taking away as opposed to what you're adding.
What would be a good analogy? A balloon or a ball of some kind?
Oil and water?
Or anything there's only two things of. That's one angle on all this too. It's the vessel analogy, that you've got a vessel full of a liquid or oil or something. Just because you drain, whether you want to call the oil or the air, the pain and the pleasure, just because you drain one doesn't change the size of the vessel.
I'm thinking of having something that's like, a cup that's half oil and half water. If you keep adding water to it, eventually all the oil is going to be pushed out because it floats on top. And so you'll eventually end up with a cup of water.
Right.
Which would be a full cup of pleasure in this particular analogy, since we've given the imprimatur of Epicurus to the analogies now. So
right. You've essentially drained all the oil from that cup that you've just mentioned, but the cup is not decreased in size.
Right.
The cup is still there at the same size. It's just full of pleasure or water at that particular point.
Right.
I mentioned earlier that you might think of this as a binary state. I think there's an analogy to be made to another argument in Epicurean philosophy. And this is an argument about the Epicurean physics, specifically atomism. I don't even know where I've read this, but you can read about people who have really gone in deep on Epicurean atomism and what it means for the smallest particle to be indivisible. There's a school of thought that the atoms, which are physically indivisible, are also intellectually indivisible. You can't even conceptualize what one half of an atom would be. And when an atom crosses a specific line, the whole atom is over the line, right? So when you've crossed that line from pain to pleasure, it's like you've crossed it all at once. How terrible is that analogy? Let me ask you that question.
I think there's a lot of good material in it, but it probably needs a little more clarification, because are you saying that it's a conceptual jump that's impossible to make for some reason, or are you saying something different? Are you saying if you define it in a way that becomes impossible to go past it, and then you try to go past it? What do you say it again?
Well, basically, it's that binary state. You're either on one side of the line or you're on the other side of the line. The middle is completely excluded here. There's two options: this side of the line, that side of the line.
What is this binary state you're talking about? Is it a definition? Is it a hypothetical? Is it real? You see why I'm asking that question? Because I do think you're right. If you define yourself as you've got to be on one side of the line or the other, and then by definition you cannot conceptualize yourself on both.
There's no sitting on the fence.
Yeah, you can't. If the line has no size to it or whatever, then you can't be sitting on it. You've got to be on one side or the other. But that's a definition, right?
There might also be an analogy here between atoms and void. I mean, you can either have atoms or you can have void, but you can't have some middle sort of existence that is out there somewhere. So I think that at least maybe is analogous to pleasure and pain. And you can have more or less void or more or less atoms in a particular defined space.
Joshua, what do you think?
Oh, I don't even know what to think at this point. I feel like the human life, along with its mental life, the physical and the mental life, it's a composite. And so like in a composite, a physical composite, you've got atoms and void. Mm-hmm. So in your mental composite, you probably got, you can experience two different things at once. Yeah, I don't know.
And is the vessel we're talking about, is that a human life taken in total sum? Is that individual moment? Is it, does it not matter?
Great question. Because that reminds me of your bowling alley.
Well, that's good, because I don't have any answers. So there.
Somebody raised the bowling alley analogy last week, and I was making a note on the forum to come back to that, because I think it was Joshua again who came up with that analogy, that you've got the pins at the end of the alley that you could consider to be your goal. But at any particular moment in your life, you're really probably somewhere rolling down the lane, and you may not ever get to the end and hit the pins. Should you consider that if your life is cut short and you never hit the pins, your life is still over? You still have to kind of evaluate whether you think you've lived well or not.
Okay, if we're going to go down that analogy then, so then the idea then is the pins are sort of the, what everybody thinks of as a full life. You live like 90 some years and you die peacefully in your bed and all that stuff. If that doesn't happen to you, it almost seems like the Epicurean analogy then would be, well, did you at least enjoy the game?
Yeah, I don't think that Epicurus would hold by any means that the ball has to reach the end of the alley and strike those pins. You've got all sorts of discussion in Epicurean philosophy about even you commit suicide under certain circumstances and so forth. And you've got obviously hard questions about what happens when you die young, when you die as a child, whatever. Does that mean that every teenager who's ever lived but who died when they were in their teens had a wasted life? I don't think Epicurus would say that by definition they did not fulfill their cosmic goal of living 70 years and having 10 children.
It's more like the how you conduct your life is the important thing, not the length of it.
And when you say important, though, I mean important to whom? Important for what? It's the best you can do. To me, it's the action of rolling down the aisle. What was the other analogy before I took you back to the bowling alley? What was the one you just raised a moment ago? The vessel?
Yeah, Don was talking about the vessel. I was talking about the binary state of
Don, you were talking about the binary state. Don asked whether the vessel represents the human life in some, or whether the vessel represents moment by moment. That's what triggered me on the bowling analogy. And I don't think you can judge anything except moment by moment. Can you help us, Martin? Is there a proper life goal, or is the goal proper just moment by moment, or is it both, or is it neither?
I mean, we certainly plan not only from one moment to the next. We may have some short-term plans, mid-term plans, long-term plans. And if death comes before, it is not a problem. Huh? But if we live that long and we didn't do the long-term plan, then we are not at maximum pleasure. Huh? So that is then what really matters. No? So if we need that long, we like to have prepared for these pleasures, which we need more time to prepare than those which we can just prepare on a whim.
I like that.
We're talking about the idea that is there some long-term goal or is it a moment-to-moment goal? There are a number of passages, I don't know if they're in the Principal Doctrines or the Vatican sayings or what, but you do have instances in which the end of life is discussed. And sometimes the description that's used for that is if you followed Epicurean philosophy properly, you come to the end of your life as to a safe harbor. Mm-hmm. And so what exactly does it mean to be a safe harbor? To me, when I think about this, I think of something like if you haven't throughout your life dealt with the issue of your own mortality or dealt with, I guess that's the main thing, really. If you don't have a good sense of where you're at philosophically when you get to the end of your life, some things are just going to crop up on you that you didn't anticipate, right? And now you're approaching the end and you've got these problems that you're not equipped to deal with. You know, you're not equipped to deal with the idea that you're going to die. And so that has to tie into it, I think, as part of the long-term goal. But as you said, you die at any age. So really at any age, you have to be prepared. That's why he says you have to study philosophy when you're old and when you're young.
That's right. I went to the letter to Menicius to get exactly that quote. That's very, very early. One of the first things he says in the letter to Menicius is that's got to indicate the importance of what we're talking about right now.
And I've read too that you can take pleasure in planning for things, and even if you die before they come to fruition, you've already taken pleasure in the idea of planning, and so even if it doesn't come to pass, you've still taken pleasure in the planning process. And then if you do finally get to put those plans into action, then that's even better.
I see that we're going to have to begin to think about coming to a conclusion for today. Why don't we try to use this statue analogy as the way to come to a conclusion today? I consider this to be very difficult, but let's try to deal with it. Don, before we started, you said you had some information on the statue that's involved, and I'm going to let you pronounce the guy's name first.
Oh, Chrysippus, you mean?
Chrysippus.
We're going to go with Chrysippus. But the fact that I had brought up before we started that he talks about that it's in the Ceramicus, or in the Greek it's the Keramikos, and that's actually the district in Athens outside the Dipylon Gate that where the garden actually was situated as well. It was the burial grounds, and they had tombs and graves, and they're all along that section of the city. And so I've always found it kind of interesting that Epicurus decided to establish his garden in among the memorials and the graves and things to remind everybody of their mortality, basically.
Well, who wants to try to explain what this analogy here is that Chrysippus thinks is so effective? Because this is the issue of the statue with his hand extended, and then this argument about whether the hand is feeling the supreme good or not. It's very difficult for me to even unwind why somebody thinks that this is a good argument or why it's a bad argument. To me, it almost doesn't make even sense at all. Why should the standard that's involved in the hand feeling the supreme good be particularly relevant? I don't really give my fingers or my toes a lot of say-so in my day-to-day life. I'm not going to get up in the morning and decide to ask my toe what it would like to do today, or my fingers what it would like to do today. But apparently this is a very brilliant argument according to the Stoics. So who wants to try to tackle what's even being asserted?
So, okay, you've got this statue, right, in the Ceramicus. I assume Ceramicus has something to do with ceramics. This is where
it was the potter's district too.
Okay, so this famous Attic pottery, right, where you've got sort of the yellowish pots with the black line work and all that on them. That's where all this stuff is made?
Yeah.
Presumably? Okay.
Right.
Okay, so there is a statue of Chrysippus in the Ceramicus. sitting with his hand extended, which hand indicates that he was fond of the following little argument. Does your hand, being in its present condition, feel the lack of anything at all? Certainly of nothing. But if pleasure were the supreme good, it would feel a lack. And then there's this I agree that follows immediately after that. It's not entirely, I presume that Torquatus is saying that, but it's not entirely clear. Pleasure, then, is not the supreme good. My father used to say that even a statue would not talk in that way if it had power of speech. So the argument here is you've got this Stoic, he's holding his hand out. He's asking you, if you were to hold your hand out like I'm holding my hand out now, are you experiencing a lack of pleasure in your hand? Because if pleasure is the supreme good, then you ought to be feeling a lack of pleasure in your hand. And if you don't feel a lack of pleasure in your hand, then pleasure must not be the supreme good. So,
and I think that agree is part of, it's supposed to be part of like some sort of Platonic dialogue, I think, is what Crispus is asking some unnamed questioner this, and then the questioner is saying, oh, I agree. And then so there's like a tiny little Platonic dialogue in there, I think, is the way that I'm taking that.
Or even Crispus himself saying,
or even, exactly. Right.
You know, he's laying this out and then saying, and I agree with, I don't even know how to take that really, but it's an interesting question because I kind of agree with Cassius. I don't really understand what it's supposed to mean. You know, if virtue is the supreme good, do you feel a lack of virtue in your hand?
Great. There you go.
Right. By what mechanism does your hand even begin to sense virtue? It doesn't even make sense. The argument here is not even wrong. It's completely nonsensical to me. If
not
God
even wrong. I like
good,
that. Not even wrong.
If God is the supreme good, do you feel a lack of God in your hand? Well, if you don't feel a lack of God in your hand, then God must not be the supreme good. I feel like this is an argument that can only be made with pleasure. But what he says here actually is, if it's the highest good, then you would have to feel the lack of it. So it should apply to anything, not just to pleasure.
I think that is an excellent observation, that they're just singling out this one supreme good that they're arguing about. And so, yeah, I think that's good.
I mean, Crispus and the Stoics were masters of logic, and there must be some, from their point of view, logic in what they're saying that would make sense of it, because I'll give them credit that usually, although I think they're wrong about things, there is a certain logical consistency usually in what they're maintaining. And in this particular example, I find it even difficult to identify what the logical consistency is, other than some kind of a premise that if you've got a living thing, I guess you can consider your hand to be a living thing. The premise seems to be that any living thing must either experience its supreme good or feel something missing in it.
Here's what I want to do. I want to tie in this Stoic argument, and I want to compare it to the Epicurean argument with the infant child. Okay? What we would say is, when you observe an infant child, completely devoid of language or culture, of learning, or a sense of politics or whatever it is, there's no wisdom in this child. There's nothing particularly special about this being. It's responding totally in accordance with nature, and its nature is to reach for pleasure and recoil from pain. So this is an argument that the Epicureans make, against people like the Stoics, obviously. But then I could see a Stoic going, well, what would it even mean for a baby to reach for virtue if virtue were the highest good? I could see a Stoic looking at that and saying, well, that argument doesn't even make sense, kind of like what we're doing here.
Mm-hmm.
How do those two tie in together? Are they similar, as I seem to be thinking maybe they are similar, or are they completely different? Is
similar
an argument better?
Similar in the way that they both have their underlying premises that you have to accept in order for the argument to make sense. Is that what you're saying?
Kind of, yeah. You almost, it's like it's set up where every answer but the answer that the questioner wants you to reach is destined to fail.
Certainly in the second sentence there, the premise of it is when it says, if pleasure were the supreme good, it would feel a lack. The premise has to be that every living thing has a supreme good, and if it's absent, then the living thing feels that it lacks it, which to me is a very complicated observation that I don't know that I accept at all.
I find it interesting that the Loeb edition does not say supreme good. It just says, but if pleasure were a good, it would want pleasure.
And that's the issue about what, the meaning of good and whether there's multiple goods. And that is interesting, Don. That takes us back into that argument, which we would never get out of if we tried to attack that today. Martin, do you have any help for us on this point?
I pretty much tend towards the side that it just doesn't make sense with the statue.
I mean, I'm sitting here with my hand, so anyway, I got a little bit of a twinge in my thumb. I got, it's a little cold. It's like, yeah, so it could feel better. But I mean, it's not like it's like any sort of great philosophical insight to say, well, my hand is cold and there's a little twinge in my thumb, so my quote unquote hand wants pleasure. Maybe I should, stick my hands in my pockets or something like that. But I mean, it just seems like such an overwrought sort of argument right there.
Well, to try to bring us home on this particular episode, the rest of this passage goes ahead and tries to explain it in a way that goes back over the issue of absence of pain and says that, well, this argument would be very effective against the Cyrenaics, but not against Epicurus. Because since Epicurus holds that absence of pain is the highest pleasure, then since the hand doesn't feel any pain, it's experiencing its highest pleasure at that moment, is what Torquatus seems to say here, which probably makes sense. But again, the whole argument is sort of very difficult. And maybe the point that we could begin to focus on as we begin to finish the episode would be that if you spend all your life obsessing over the logical unwinding of this argument, then you may never get anywhere productively further with the rest of your life. And you've got to get past this. Obviously, these Stoics, Chrysippus a Stoic, I presume he was, right? Am I saying that wrong, guys? Yes, he was. He didn't predate the Stoics. Obviously, the Stoics and even Torquatus in responding to them were very serious in engaging in this argument here. But I think there's an awful lot of us that it really doesn't even make sense to. And we have to decide, are we going to spend our time unwinding an argument that doesn't appear to even make sense to us? Or are we going to go ahead and live the rest of our lives taking away the major point, which I would contend would be that pleasure as a feeling is something real, whereas supernatural gods and absolute virtues are not real. And so we go with what is real, and we actually live our lives while we have time to do it and make the best of the life that we have in front of us. I don't even know that I could refer people to a particular article that I think has done a really good job of unwinding this. Does anybody know any article they've read, or has anybody read a particularly brilliant analysis of this passage that they could refer to? I don't think I can after all the years I've been reading Epicurean philosophy. I mean, I've got all sorts of articles on different topics that I can point to that I think are just brilliantly written and really something important to read. But this one, I don't think I've ever found anybody who really unwound it to my satisfaction.
I guess there's our homework.
Well, it may take a while. I'm not sure I would advise anybody to hold their breath waiting for the answer to this one. Because next week, we were going to come back to what I think makes it very clear in unwinding all of these questions that we have today. Next week, he's going to hypothesize, let's think about what would be the best life, and let's think about what would be the worst life. Right. And I think we'll see when we get to that example that it's very clear that you're not going for some kind of an undefined, ambiguous anesthesia. You're going to a life of pleasure that is very recognizable to all of us normal people without resort to some kind of logical flip-flops to try to make sense of it. So I think there is a way out of it, and Epicurus will pointing to
guide the way. He will guide the way.
He will guide the way. Now they think that the ancient Dux Vitae. Apparently, the people represented by Torquatus think that it's very important not just to use the common sense definition of pleasure, but also to unwind these logical definitions of the highest pleasure and absence of pain, and the Cyrenaics and active pleasure versus resting pleasure. And if that floats your boat, then there appear to be no limit to the amount of time you can spend in talking about it. But I don't gather that Martin spends too many hours a day worrying about unwinding that. Do you, Martin?
No, definitely not.
And it may all point back to what Cicero started this section talking about, where Epicurus insisted there's no need for an elaborate logical demonstration that pleasure is to be desired and pain is to be avoided. That may be the most profound. It's just like the issue of Who's the philosopher who proved that motion is possible by walking across the room in response to Parmenides, or one of those logical proofs that motion was impossible? It may be that ultimately this kind of a practical rejection of logical gamesmanship is at the root of the solution.
And I will say that I do like Martin's explanation that he gave just a little bit ago about that his experience feeds back into his intuition, and you experience other things and you see what gave you pleasure in the past. You sort of add that to your experience and your intuition, and so it becomes almost like a reflex action to make those assessments in a short amount of time, so you can just move on with your life.
Yes. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about closing thoughts for today. And if anybody wants to address it one more time, we want to, I think, close the episode by reassuring the people listening to the podcast that we are not going to spend the rest of our lives debating the meaning of absence of pain and some of the definitions that go into these games that the Stoics like to play. We're going to move on with practical analysis of how to live your life the best way possible. But in the meantime, for those who are concerned about the logical arguments, there's a way through those as well. So, Martin, closing thoughts for this week.
No, nothing to add for today.
Joshua.
I'm trying to think if there's a difference between, maybe how we read Lucretius, because Lucretius has this quote that I just love, where he says that he's talking to Memmius, and he says that if you doubt or stray even a little, then slow old age will creep in before my argument in verse is finished. Before my honeyed tongue from its rich sources pours forth my argument in verse to convince you. For some reason, I can take as much as Lucretius can give me of his argument, because he's talking about how the universe works. I find that endlessly fascinating. But arguing about pleasure, to me, I find kind of dreary in a way. Like, I argue about it. I just want to experience it.
The whole phrase there about coating the rim of the cup with honey is, to me, another example of how you're pointing to the feeling of pleasure as ultimately what's important and ultimately what will lead you through the complicated questions.
That's a good point. And when you do put rim around the honey of the cup to give the boy his medicine, all right, you've taken that and now you're eating the honey. Does your hand feel any pleasure or any amount of pleasure? I really want to get this down. I know you're taking your medicine and you're having issues, but let me talk to you about your hand. It's just, there's more important things to worry about than whether or not your hand feels a lack of pleasure.
Before we move on to Don, and I don't mean to cut you off, Joshua, if you have something else to add, please do there.
Go ahead.
But I was just going to say, what Joshua has just said is so important, because people get turned off by this back and forth word gaming. And if these Stoics and these other people who are playing the word game, if they succeed in turning people off and making them think that there's no way out of these questions, then they've succeeded in what I think is their ultimate goal in the first place, which is manipulation of innocent, good people who would like to know the honest answer to questions and would like to just live their lives and be left alone and have the best life possible to them. They're not interested in manipulating other people. They're not interested in killing everybody else or controlling the world. They just want to live their own lives as happily as they possibly can. And unless you get past these games of logic, then these people just I have a picture in my mind of people just dejected, turning away, walking away. And I have friends who fit that exact category, who just think everything is so complicated. There's no way to find the truth. I'm just going to go off and just hang my head and immerse myself in despair because there's no way out. And in one of the few good things I'd say about a Stoic, there's a passage in Seneca that I'll find. This is the issue about the words of the philosopher who don't heal or bring pleasure and so forth are worthless.
Right.
Don.
Yeah, you brought up here at the end then, so I'll sort of just piggyback on that. There's an Epicurean phrase. The whole idea that it strikes me that Epicurean philosophy, it's very practical, it's very common sense, it's very concerned with letting people, live the best life they can. And Epicurus tried to reach the maximum number of people and make, that's why he wrote the epitomes and the summaries and the principal doctrines and all those things to get it out to as many people as he could. But there's also a lot of underlying deep philosophy behind it as well. But you don't have to know all of that to get practical benefit from practicing the philosophy. That would be it for me.
Okay, then my quote in the episode today will be from line 30 of the same text here. So he says we need no reasoning or debate to show why pleasure is matter for desire, pain for aversion. These facts, he thinks, are simply perceived, just as the fact that fire is hot, snow is white, and honey sweet. No one of which facts are we bound to support by elaborate arguments. It's enough merely to draw attention to the fact, as there's a difference between proof and formal argument on the one hand and a direction of the attention on the other. The one process reveals to us mysteries and things under a veil, so to speak. The other enables us to pronounce upon patent and evident facts.
Like pleasure is good.
Pleasure is good. Pain is bad. Exactly. And you can't let yourself get twisted around as a pretzel, worried about the definition of those terms. Let's close for the day, and we'll come back in about a week. Thank you again, as always.
Great discussion. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.